He should have turned back the moment he saw the blue dress. But some mistakes don't feel like mistakes until the sun goes down. The old-timers used to say, and Ethan Cole understood that better than most men who rode alone across West Texas. Because a man who lives by silence learns to listen to the things that don't belong. Like a flash of color where there should be dust and brown and faded sky. Like a woman stepping out of a dressmaker's shop in a town that barely trusted strangers, let alone someone who didn't look like she came from any place that had a name on a map. Ethan had been leaning against the hitching post across the street, hat low, eyes half closed like he wasn't paying attention. But he saw her the second she pushed open that door, the bell above it ringing once, sharp, then gone. And for a moment, everything else on that street seemed to pause. Like even the wind had questions. The dress was blue, not the soft blue of worn denim or river water, but something deeper, cleaner, almost out of place against the dry boards and sun-bleached buildings. And she held herself like she didn't want to be seen, shoulders tight, steps quick, eyes fixed ahead without meeting a single face. Now that alone wasn't enough to make a man follow. Not in a land where folks kept to themselves or learned the hard way. But Ethan noticed something else, something small, something most men would have missed. She wasn't wearing boots. Not the kind anyone walking these roads would need. Just thin soles that wouldn't last a mile on gravel. And yet she stepped like she'd already walked 10, maybe 20, without slowing down. He pushed off the post without thinking too hard about it, because thinking too much had never saved him from anything. And his boots hit the dirt with that familiar crunch as he crossed the street, keeping distance, keeping quiet. The way he used to when tracking wasn't just a habit, but a job, a skill that paid in coin and sometimes in things harder to forget. She didn't look back, not once, and that made him narrow his eyes under the brim of his hat, because people always look back when they feel watched, unless they already know someone is there and choose not to care, or worse, they're more afraid of what's ahead than what's behind. The town fell away faster than it should have, buildings thinning into open land, the road turning into nothing but packed earth stretching out toward low hills and scattered brush, the kind of country where a person could disappear if they knew how. And Ethan had seen enough disappearances to know they rarely started with something as simple as a new dress. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint scent of leather and distant horses, and that's when he saw it, just for a heartbeat. The fabric of that blue dress shifting enough to reveal something hidden beneath, a glint of silver, a piece of turquoise catching the light before it vanished again, and Ethan slowed his step, the world around him tightening into focus, because he knew that kind of work, knew it didn't come from any shop in this town. And suddenly this wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about a line being crossed, one he'd spent years learning to recognize, and without a word, without a sound, he followed her past the last fence post, into land where the rules changed, and men like him were supposed to know better than to keep going. The ground changed under his boots about half a mile past the last fence post, the packed earth giving way to loose gravel and patches of dry grass that whispered with every step. And Ethan Cole felt that old instinct settle into his bones like it had never left, the quiet awareness that every sound mattered. Every shift in wind carried a story if a man knew how to listen. She was still ahead of him, the blue dress moving steady against the pale horizon, not fast, not slow, just certain, like she had walked this path more times than the land cared to remember. And that was what bothered him most. Not that she was out here alone, but that she did not hesitate once, not even when the trail split into nothing but open country where a wrong turn could cost a man a day or more. He kept his distance, maybe 40 yards now, far enough to stay unseen, close enough to catch the small details, the way her hands stayed near her sides, never reaching for anything, the way her head tilted just slightly whenever the wind shifted, as if she was measuring something he could not see. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow passing over both of them in slow arcs, and for a second Ethan wondered if she would look up, if that small break in pattern would reveal something human, something uncertain, but she did not. She just kept walking, and that made him tighten his jaw, because people always broke pattern eventually, unless they had a reason not to. Another gust of wind rolled down from the hills, carrying with it the faint smell of sage and something else, something older, and this time the fabric of her dress lifted just enough for him to see that flash again. the silver and turquoise hidden beneath, and he knew then it was no accident. No piece bought from a trader or picked up in town. It was placed there, hidden on purpose, like a secret meant to stay buried until it could not anymore. Ethan slowed, crouching slightly as he reached down and picked up something caught between two stones, a thin thread of blue fabric torn clean, too clean for wear and tear, and when he rubbed it between his fingers he could feel the quality, not something made for long trails or hard work, something made to be seen, and yet here it was, being dragged across miles of unforgiving ground. He looked up again, eyes narrowing, because the story was shifting in ways he did not like, and the part of him that had spent years reading tracks and people alike began to whisper that he was not the one doing the tracking anymore, that maybe he had been let out here from the moment he stepped off that hitching post. She slowed then, just a fraction, enough that he noticed, enough that the distance between them shortened without him meaning it to, and for the first time since she left town, her shoulders lifted slightly with a breath that looked heavier than the ones before, like the land ahead carried weight even she could not ignore. The hills rose in front of them now, low but jagged, the kind of terrain that hid more than it showed, and Ethan felt the air change, not colder, not warmer, just different, like stepping into a place where the rules he knew did not quite apply the same way. His hand hovered near his belt out of habit, not fear, just readiness, because whatever this was, whatever she was, it had already pulled him farther than he had planned to go, and turning back now would not give him answers, only questions that would follow him longer than any trail. She stopped then, not suddenly, not sharply, just a quiet halt like she had reached a point only she could see. And Ethan took one more step before realizing she was no longer moving, and that was when the silence around them grew thick enough to feel, the wind easing, the hawk gone, the land holding its breath, and for the first time since he began following, Ethan Cole understood that whatever came next was not something he could read from tracks or distance. It was something waiting to be faced, whether he was ready or not. She did not turn around right away, and that was the first thing that unsettled him, because most people, when they realized they were no longer alone, reacted in one of two ways. They either faced it or they fled from it. But she did neither. She simply stood there with her back to him, as if she had known the exact moment he would step close enough to matter. And for a long second the only sound between them was the faint movement of wind slipping through dry brush. Ethan Cole stopped about 15 feet behind her, close enough now to see the small tremor in the fabric of her blue dress, not from fear, but from the steady rise and fall of controlled breathing. And he understood then that whatever this was, it had been decided long before he caught up to her. "You walked a long way without looking back," he said, his voice low. Even, not a threat, not an invitation, just a statement placed between them like a marker on the ground. And for a moment she did not answer, her head tilting just slightly as if listening to something beyond him, something carried on the air. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he expected, but it carried a weight that did not belong to someone running or hiding. "You should not have followed," she said, each word careful, measured, shaped by a language that was not her first, and Ethan narrowed his eyes, not at the warning but at the calm beneath it, because fear usually left cracks in a voice, and hers held none. He took another step, slow enough to show he was not rushing her, but firm enough to make it clear he was not leaving either. "Then you should have picked a road that did not lead out of town like that," he replied, and that was when she turned, not sharply, not with surprise, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided how this moment would unfold. And her eyes met his without hesitation, dark, steady, carrying something deeper than fear, something closer to urgency held tight beneath control. Up close he could see the dust on her skin, the faint line where the sun had touched her face, and the way her hands stayed open at her sides, not reaching, not defensive, just present, and that unsettled him more than any sudden move would have, because it meant she was not preparing to run or fight. She was waiting. "If they see me," she said again, a little stronger this time, "I will not make it back." And Ethan felt the words settle into place without fully understanding them, because the direction behind him led to town, not danger, and the land ahead was where a person disappeared, not survived. So her warning bent against the logic he trusted, and that made him shift his stance slightly, his hand hovering near his belt without touching it, not out of fear but habit, because habit had kept him alive longer than most. "Who is looking for you?" he asked, and this time there was a pause that lasted just long enough to matter, just long enough for the wind to change direction again, carrying with it a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for distance or memory, the soft rhythm of hooves far off where the hills broke the horizon. Her gaze flicked past him then, not in panic but in recognition, and when it returned to his face there was something different in it, something closer to resignation than fear, like a door closing quietly inside her. "Not who," she said, "what I did." And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest at that, not because of the answer, but because of how little it explained and how much it suggested. And for the first time since he stepped off that street, he realized this was not about tracking a stranger across open land. This was about stepping into a story that had already begun, one where the ending was moving toward them whether he chose to stay or not. And somewhere behind him, just beyond sight, the sound of those distant hooves grew a little clearer, a little closer, like time itself had decided to catch up. The sound of hooves did not rush in like a storm. It crept closer in measured rhythm, steady and controlled, the kind that spoke of riders who knew exactly where they were going and had no reason to hurry. And Ethan Cole felt that rhythm settle into his spine the same way a distant thunder used to. Not fear, not yet, but awareness sharpened to a fine edge. He did not turn right away, not fully, just enough to angle his head and listen, because out here sound carried truth before sight ever could. And what he heard told him there was more than one rider, maybe 5, maybe 10, moving as one instead of scattered, which meant purpose, not chance. When he looked back at her, she had not moved, not a single step, and that stillness said more than any warning she could have spoken, because people who planned to run did not stand like that, and people who expected to fight did not keep their hands open at their sides. She was waiting, and that meant whatever was coming was not a surprise to her. "You knew they were coming," he said, not accusing, just placing the truth where it belonged, and she held his gaze for a moment before answering, her eyes steady but carrying something deeper now, something heavier. "I hoped I had more time," she replied, and there it was, not fear, not panic, but something closer to regret, like a clock she could hear ticking down that he had only just noticed. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, boots grinding against the gravel as the sound of hooves grew clearer, closer, and the air around them seemed to tighten with it, like the land itself was making room for what was about to arrive. And for the first time since he stepped off that hitching post, he considered the possibility that following her had not been a choice at all, but something he had been drawn into without seeing the edges of it. "What did you do?" he asked again, quieter this time, because the question felt different now, less about suspicion and more about understanding what he had stepped into. And she looked past him once more, toward the rising shape of the hills where the riders would appear, and when she spoke, her voice carried something that did not belong to someone hiding. It belonged to someone carrying a weight she had already accepted. "I crossed a line they cannot ignore," she said, and Ethan felt the words settle into place without needing more explanation, because he knew about lines like that, invisible until someone stepped over them, and then suddenly sharper than any fence or boundary. The first rider appeared at the crest of the hill then, just a shape against the fading light, followed by another, and another, their silhouettes forming slowly like figures drawn out of the land itself, and none of them rushed forward. None of them called out. They simply moved down the slope with quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to announce itself. Ethan turned fully now, facing them, his body placing itself between her and the approaching riders without him thinking about it, not out of loyalty, not yet, but because that was what a man did when something unknown stepped too close, and his hand hovered near his belt again, not gripping, not drawing, just ready, because readiness had kept him standing through worse than this. Behind him, he could hear her breathing, still steady, still controlled, and that steadiness pressed against his thoughts in a way that did not fit the story he had built in his head, because if she was running from them, she would not stand like this, and if she belonged to them, she would not be wearing that blue dress like a signal that did not match the land. The riders closed the distance to maybe 50 yards, then slowed, their formation tightening. Without a word, and Ethan saw the details now, the way they sat their horses with ease, the way their eyes stayed fixed not on him, but on her, and something shifted in his chest at that, something small but undeniable, because he had expected attention, suspicion, maybe even warning, but what he saw instead was something quieter, something harder to name. The lead rider stepped forward then, his horse stopping with a soft exhale of breath, and for a long second no one spoke. The space between them filled only with the sound of wind moving across the open ground, and Ethan felt the weight of that silence settle around them like a question waiting to be answered, one that did not belong to him alone, and not to her either, but to whatever truth had been hidden long enough to reach this moment. No one reached for a weapon, and that was the first thing that did not make sense to Ethan Cole, because men who rode in formation like that, men who moved across open land with purpose, usually carried tension with them like a storm about to break. But these riders brought something else, something quieter, something that settled over the ground like dust instead of wind. The lead rider studied the woman in the blue dress, not with anger, not even with suspicion, but with a focus that felt older than either of them. And Ethan felt that shift again, deeper now, like the ground beneath his understanding was giving way 1 inch at a time. "You crossed far," the rider said finally, his voice steady, not raised, yet it carried across the space between them without effort. And the woman behind Ethan stepped forward just enough for him to feel it, a slight movement that changed everything. Because she was no longer hiding behind him. She was stepping into whatever this was on her own terms. "I had to," she answered, and there was no defense in her voice, no attempt to explain beyond that simple truth. And Ethan glanced back at her, just for a moment, long enough to see that her eyes were no longer on him at all. They were fixed on the man in front of them, steady, unyielding, like whatever fear had lived there before had already been set aside. The rider nodded once, slow, thoughtful, as if weighing something that did not belong to the moment alone, and the others behind him remained still, their horses shifting only slightly under them, breath rising in faint clouds as the evening cooled. Ethan lowered his hand from where it hovered near his belt, not because the tension had passed, but because it had changed shape into something he did not yet understand, and that kind of uncertainty demanded stillness more than action. "You were seen," the rider continued, and this time the words carried more weight, not accusation, but consequence. And the woman drew in a breath that was just a little deeper than the ones before. "I know," she said, and there it was again, that acceptance, like she had already counted the cost before she ever stepped into that dressmaker's shop. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, because pieces were beginning to fall into place, not clearly, not fully, but enough to show that the story he had built in his mind was wrong in ways that mattered, and he shifted his stance, turning just enough to stand beside her instead of in front of her, not a gesture of protection, not yet, but an acknowledgement that whatever this was, it was no longer his to control. The rider's gaze flicked to Ethan then, just once, sharp and assessing, and in that brief look Ethan felt himself measured, not as an enemy, not as an ally, but as something in between, something that had stepped into a path without understanding where it led. "You brought him," the rider said, not as a question but as a simple observation, and the woman shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. He followed, and there was no blame in it, no attempt to shift what had happened, just the truth laid bare between them. A faint breeze moved through the space, catching the edge of the blue dress again, and this time the hidden necklace slipped free enough for everyone to see, the turquoise stone resting against the fabric like a quiet declaration of something that did not belong to the town behind them or the land beneath their feet alone, and the rider's eyes dropped to it, lingering for a moment before lifting back to her face. "Then you chose to return," he said, and the words settled into the air with a kind of finality that made Ethan feel the weight of them even without knowing all they carried. Because return meant more than distance, it meant crossing something that could not be undone. The woman lifted her chin slightly, her posture straightening in a way that no longer spoke of hiding or running, but of standing where she was meant to stand. "I chose to bring what was needed," she said, and for the first time since this began, Ethan felt something shift fully into place, not the whole truth, not yet, but enough to understand that this was never about a woman in a blue dress trying to disappear. It was about someone who had stepped into danger on purpose, carrying something that mattered more than the cost of being seen. And as the silence settled again between all of them, heavier now but clearer, Ethan Cole realized that the mistake he thought he made by following her might not have been a mistake at all, but the only way he would ever see what came next. The words settled into the space between them like dust that refused to lift, and for a moment no one moved. Not the riders, not the woman, not even Ethan Cole, who stood there feeling the shape of the moment shift into something heavier than he had expected when he first stepped off that quiet street. The lead rider's gaze remained on her, steady and measured, as if he was reading not just what she had done, but why she had done it. And Ethan realized that whatever line she had crossed, it was not one that could be explained with simple words or settled with quick judgment. The breeze picked up again, soft but insistent, brushing against the blue fabric and revealing more of the necklace beneath, the turquoise catching the fading light in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and the rider's eyes followed that movement before lifting once more to meet hers. "You carry it openly now," he said, and there was something different in his tone. Not disapproval, not approval, but recognition, as if that single detail held more meaning than anything else spoken so far. She reached up then, not quickly, not defensively, just enough to let her fingers rest against the stone, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that had not been there before. "It was never meant to be hidden forever," she said, and Ethan felt those words settle deeper than the others, because they did not sound like defiance. They sounded like truth that had waited its time. Behind the lead rider, one of the others shifted slightly in the saddle, not in impatience but in acknowledgement, and the horses responded with small movements of their own, breath steady, ears flicking toward the wind, as if they too were listening to something beyond the moment. Ethan glanced from one face to another, trying to read what he could, but there was no anger there, no immediate threat, only a kind of quiet attention that made him realize he was standing in the middle of something that had been unfolding long before he arrived. "What you bring," the rider continued, his voice lowering just enough to draw the focus tighter. "It changes more than you think." And the woman nodded once, a small motion that carried the weight of understanding. "It already has," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no second thought, just certainty. Ethan shifted his stance again, not out of discomfort, but because the ground beneath his assumptions no longer felt steady, and he found himself looking at her differently now, not as someone being pursued or someone hiding, but as someone who had chosen a path that led directly into this moment, knowing what waited on the other side. The light was beginning to fade, stretching long shadows across the land, and in that dimming glow the blue of her dress seemed to deepen, less like something out of place and more like something that belonged to both worlds she had crossed between. "You walked into their town," the rider said, and this time there was a hint of something else in his voice, not anger, not warning, but something closer to respect wrapped in caution. "Alone," and she held his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it spoke of choice, not accident. Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, and for the first time since this began, he understood that whatever danger he had imagined was not the kind that came from sudden conflict. It was the kind that came from decisions that could not be undone, from lines that once crossed did not disappear. The silence returned again, but it was no longer uncertain. It was full, like a space waiting for something to be acknowledged, and Ethan felt it then, clear and undeniable, that he was no longer just an observer in this moment. He was part of it now, whether he had intended to be or not. And somewhere in that realization, something shifted inside him, not fear, not resolve, but a quiet understanding that sometimes a man does not choose the story he walks into. He only chooses whether to stand still when it finally reveals itself. The light dropped another inch toward the horizon, and with it came a stillness that felt less like calm and more like a decision waiting to be spoken out loud. And Ethan Cole noticed how none of the riders shifted anymore, not even their horses, as if whatever came next required every piece of attention they had. The lead rider studied the woman for a long second, then another, and in that quiet stretch of time Ethan realized something he had missed before. This was not a man deciding what to do. This was a man confirming what had already been decided somewhere else, somewhere beyond this open stretch of land. "Show me," the rider said at last, and the words carried no demand, only expectation, like he already knew the answer would come. The woman did not hesitate, not this time. And that alone told Ethan more than anything she had said so far, because hesitation belonged to doubt, and she had none left. Her hand moved slowly to the side of her dress, fingers slipping beneath the blue fabric where it had been stitched just a little tighter than the rest, and Ethan's eyes followed the motion without thinking, his breath slowing as if the air itself had thickened. She pulled free a small bundle, wrapped in cloth that did not match the dress, darker, worn at the edges, something that had been carried longer than the garment meant to hide it. And when she held it out, both hands steady, the rider leaned forward just slightly in the saddle, his focus narrowing to that single object. No one else moved, not a whisper of sound from the others, just the faint creak of leather and the quiet rhythm of horses breathing, and Ethan felt that same tightening in his chest again, not fear, not exactly, but the weight of a moment that could not be taken back once it passed. The rider dismounted then, slow and deliberate, boots touching the ground with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should have in the silence, and he stepped closer, closing the space between them without breaking eye contact, not with her, not with what she held. When he reached out, his hand paused just short of the bundle, like he understood that what he was about to take was more than an object. It was the reason all of them were standing here instead of somewhere else. "You went alone for this," he said, quieter now, and she gave the smallest nod. "There was no other way," she answered, and Ethan felt that truth settle into place with everything else, because he had seen enough of this land to know when a choice was not really a choice at all. The rider took the bundle then, carefully, almost gently, and unwrapped the cloth just enough to look inside. And though Ethan could not see what was there, he saw the change in the man's face. Not surprise, not relief, but something deeper, something that shifted the weight of the moment into something steadier, something certain. Behind them, one of the riders let out a slow breath, barely audible, but it carried across the space like a signal, and the others seemed to ease just a fraction, not relaxed, but no longer holding the same tight edge they had before. The man wrapped the bundle again and held it close for a moment before lifting his eyes back to her. And when he spoke this time, the words were different. "You carried this through their town," he said, and it was not a question, just a statement of fact that held more meaning than Ethan could fully grasp. She met his gaze without lowering hers. "They would not have given it to us," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only clarity, the kind that came from knowing exactly how the world worked and choosing to move through it anyway. Ethan looked between them, the pieces aligning in his mind now, slow but undeniable, and he understood that whatever she had brought back was not just something valuable, it was something necessary, something that had required her to step into a place she did not belong and risk being seen for what she was. The rider nodded once more, deeper this time, and as he turned slightly, holding the bundle with care, Ethan realized that the moment had shifted again, not ending, not yet, but moving forward into something that felt less like confrontation and more like consequence. And standing there between them, he felt the quiet pull of it, the sense that what had been hidden was no longer hidden, and that whatever came next would not be decided by suspicion or fear, but by the truth that had finally been brought into the open. The bundle stayed in the rider's hands, but something had already shifted beyond it, something Ethan Cole could feel in the way the air moved again. Not tense anymore, not waiting, but settling, like a storm that had passed without breaking. The lead rider turned slightly, not away from her, not yet, but enough to show the others what he held, and though none of them spoke, the change moved through them like a quiet signal, shoulders easing, reins loosening just a fraction, the kind of reaction that came not from surprise, but from recognition. Ethan watched it happen and understood then that whatever had been carried inside that cloth was not just needed, it had been expected, and that meant this moment had been waiting long before he ever stepped into it. "You took a risk that was not yours alone," the rider said, his voice calm, steady, but now carrying something else beneath it, something closer to weight than judgment. And the woman did not look away, did not lower her head. She simply stood there in that blue dress that no longer seemed out of place, as if the land itself had decided to accept it. "It was mine to take," she answered, and the certainty in her voice did not challenge him. It completed the thought, and Ethan felt that answer settle deeper than anything before it, because it spoke of responsibility carried without permission. The rider held her gaze for a long second, then nodded slowly. Not in agreement, not entirely, but in acknowledgement of something that did not need to be spoken further, and he turned his attention briefly toward Ethan, just long enough for their eyes to meet again. And this time the look was different, less measuring, more knowing, as if Ethan's place in this moment had been decided simply by the fact that he had stayed. "You walked far for a man who did not belong to this path," the rider said, and Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not have words, but because none of them seemed to fit the shape of what had happened, and that was a rare thing for him. He shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the gravel, and finally said, "I thought I was following something that did not add up," and the rider studied him for a moment before replying. "And now?" And that single question hung in the air without needing more. Ethan glanced back at the woman, at the blue fabric catching the last light, at the necklace now resting openly against it, no longer hidden, and something in him settled into place. Not understanding, not fully, but acceptance of what stood in front of him. "Now I know I was the one who did not understand," he said, and the truth of it carried farther than he expected, because it was not just for the rider, it was for himself. The silence that followed was not heavy anymore. It was clear, like a space where something had been set down after being carried too long, and the rider gave a slight nod, not to Ethan, not entirely, but to the moment itself. He stepped back then, returning to his horse, the bundle held close as if it belonged there now. And as he mounted, the others shifted with him, not hurried, not tense, just ready. Before they turned, his gaze returned to the woman one last time. "You will come back with us," he said. And it was not a command. It was a path already laid out, and she inclined her head once, a quiet acceptance that matched everything she had done to reach this point. Ethan watched as the riders began to turn toward the hills again, their movement smooth, unified, and for a second he thought the moment was ending without him, that whatever this was would pass on without leaving a mark. But then the woman looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since they left the town, and in that look there was something he had not expected, not fear, not distance, but something closer to recognition. She took a single step toward him, just enough to close the space that had remained between them, and spoke quietly, so that only he could hear. "You should not have followed," she said again. But this time it did not sound like a warning. It sounded like something else entirely. Something closer to truth revealed, too late to change anything. And as she turned to follow the riders, Ethan Cole stood there for a moment longer, watching the blue dress move away into the fading light, and realized that whatever he thought he had been chasing, it was not her. It was the understanding he had been missing all along. He could have turned back right then, could have let the dust swallow their tracks and convinced himself it had nothing to do with him. But Ethan Cole did not move, not when the riders began to disappear into the low hills, not when the sound of hooves softened into distance, and not when the blue of her dress became just another color fading into the land. Something held him there, not curiosity anymore, not even doubt, but a quiet pull that settled deeper than reason, the kind that did not ask permission before it took hold. He looked down at the ground where she had stood, at the faint imprint left behind, and for a moment he considered how easy it would be to step away, to return to the town where things made more sense, where lines were clear and choices felt smaller. But the thought did not sit right, not after everything he had seen, not after the way her voice had carried that final truth without asking him to understand it. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the last trace of their passing, and Ethan lifted his head toward the hills, eyes narrowing as the light thinned across the ridges, and he realized something that had not been clear before. She had not just walked back toward them. She had walked toward something that mattered more than the risk, and that kind of choice did not end where the trail stopped. He took a step forward, then another, not rushing, not chasing, just moving in the direction they had gone, because standing still felt like turning away from something he was only beginning to see. The land changed as he moved, the ground rising gently, the brush growing thicker in places, shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped lower, and with each step the distance between what he thought he knew and what he had just witnessed grew wider, not narrower. He replayed her words in his mind, the calm in them, the certainty the absence of fear even when she spoke of what could happen if she were seen. And it did not match the stories he had heard, the ones told in town about lines that could not be crossed, about people who stayed on one side or the other, as if the world were that simple. Somewhere ahead, just beyond the ridge, he caught the faint echo of voices, not loud, not urgent, just present, carried on the air like something that belonged there, and he slowed his pace, not wanting to break whatever distance still existed between him and what lay ahead, because this was not something he could approach the way he had approached everything else in his life. He reached the edge of the rise and stopped, just short of revealing himself, and from there he could see them again, the riders gathered in a loose formation, their horses at rest, the woman among them no longer standing apart, no longer defined by that blue dress alone, but by something else entirely, something that placed her within the circle instead of outside it. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just watching. And for the first time since this began, he understood that he was not meant to interrupt what was happening. He was meant to witness it, to see the part of the story that had never been told where he came from. The bundle she had carried was passed carefully from one set of hands to another, treated with a care that spoke of more than value. And as he watched, the pieces aligned in a way that left no room for the assumptions he had started with. Because this was not about crossing a line for the sake of defiance. It was about crossing it, because something on the other side could not be reached any other way. The light faded further, shadows merging into the shapes of the land, and Ethan felt that quiet understanding settle deeper inside him, not as a sudden revelation, but as something steady, something that would remain long after this moment passed. And as he stood there on the edge of it all, he realized that following her had not led him to danger or mistake. It had led him to a truth he had never been close enough to see, one that did not ask him to change the past, only to understand it differently than he ever had before. He stayed on that ridge longer than he meant to, long enough for the last edge of sunlight to slip behind the hills and turn everything below into shapes and shadows instead of people and purpose. And still Ethan Cole did not move, because what he was watching was not something a man could walk into without changing it. And he had begun to understand that his place in this moment was not to step forward, but to see clearly for once. The voices below carried softly through the cooling air, not raised, not urgent, just steady, like words spoken between people who already understood one another. And that steadiness pressed against everything he had been taught about distance and division, about who belonged where and why. He watched as the bundle was opened again, more carefully this time, passed between hands with a kind of quiet reverence, and though he still could not see what it held, he could see what it meant, because the way those men stood around it was not about ownership. It was about relief, about something that had been missing finally returned. The woman stood among them now, no longer apart, her blue dress catching what little light remained, not as something out of place, but as something that had bridged two worlds without asking permission from either, and Ethan felt that image settle into him in a way he knew would not leave. He shifted his weight slightly, careful not to disturb the loose stones beneath his boots, and in that small movement, he felt the distance between himself and everything below grow clearer, not in space, but in understanding, because he had spent years believing that lines existed for a reason, that crossing them led to consequences that could not be undone. And now he was watching someone prove that sometimes those consequences were exactly what had to happen. A faint sound reached him then, not from the group below, but from behind, somewhere farther back along the trail he had taken, and he turned his head slightly, listening, the old habit returning without effort. And for a moment he thought it was nothing more than the wind shifting direction again. But then he caught it more clearly, the distant creak of wood, the uneven rhythm of a wagon moving slower than it should across rough ground. He frowned slightly, eyes narrowing as he tried to place it, because there was no reason for a wagon to be out here this late, not this far from the main road, not without purpose, and that thought lingered just long enough to pull his attention away from the scene below. When he looked back, the riders had begun to move again, not away, not yet, but shifting into a formation that suggested they were preparing for something more than simply returning home, and the lead rider stood at the center of it, the bundle still in his hands, speaking quietly to the others in a tone that carried authority without force. The woman turned slightly then, her gaze lifting just enough to meet the ridge where Ethan stood, and for a brief second he thought she had seen him, really seen him, not as the man who had followed her, but as someone who now understood a piece of what she had carried. And there was no surprise in her expression, no question, just a calm recognition that felt like the closing of a circle he had not known he was part of. He held her gaze for that brief moment before it broke, before she turned back to the others, and something inside him settled into place. Not completely, not fully, but enough to quiet the part of him that had been searching for answers since he stepped into this story. The wagon sound came again, closer now, clearer, and Ethan shifted his stance, glancing once more between the approaching noise and the group below, and for the first time since this began, he felt the shape of something new forming, not conflict, not yet, but a crossing of paths that had not been meant to meet until now. And as the last light faded completely and the first hint of night settled over the land, Ethan Cole understood that whatever truth he had just witnessed was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something that would not stay hidden much longer. The sound of the wagon did not belong to the land the way the riders did. It dragged against it, uneven and strained, with creaking underweight that was not meant for these narrow trails. And Ethan Cole felt that difference immediately, the way a man could tell when something entered a place without understanding it. He shifted his position slightly along the ridge, lowering his stance just enough to keep himself unseen while giving himself a clearer view of the path behind him. And there it was now, breaking through the dim light. A single wagon pulled by two tired horses, their pace slow but stubborn, as if whoever guided them had no intention of turning back. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he studied the shape. The outline of a driver hunched forward, reins held tight, not the relaxed posture of a trader or traveler, but something more rigid, more deliberate, and that alone told him this was no accident. No lost soul wandering too far off course. He glanced back toward the group below, where the riders had begun to gather closer around the lead man, the bundle still at the center of their attention, and for a moment it seemed like the two worlds had not yet noticed each other, like they were moving on separate lines that had not crossed. But Ethan knew better, because out here paths crossed whether men planned them to or not. The wagon rolled closer, wheels catching on rocks, the sound sharper now, louder against the quiet of the hills, and one of the riders below turned his head slightly, just enough to show that the noise had reached them too. And with that small movement, everything began to shift again. The lead rider looked up, his gaze following the direction of the sound, and the stillness that had settled over the group tightened once more, not with panic, but with awareness, like a calm surface disturbed by something that could not be ignored. The woman stood among them, her posture unchanged, but Ethan saw it now, the way her shoulders drew just a fraction tighter, the way her eyes moved toward the same distant point, and for the first time since she had handed over the bundle, there was something else there, not fear, but concern shaped by understanding. The wagon crested the lower ridge, fully visible now, and Ethan caught sight of something tied along its side, shapes wrapped in cloth, secured carefully but without the care he had seen among the riders, and whatever it was, it mattered enough to be brought this far. The driver pulled the horses to a slower pace as the terrain grew rougher, and when he finally lifted his head, Ethan saw the set of his face even from that distance, tight, focused, like a man carrying something he did not fully understand but intended to deliver anyway. Below, the riders began to spread slightly, not forming a wall, not preparing for anything abrupt, but adjusting their positions in a way that opened space instead of closing it. And that alone told Ethan more than any sudden movement would have, because they were not meeting force with force, they were making room for something to arrive. The lead rider stepped forward a few paces, the bundle still held close, and the silence that followed felt different now, not just heavy with meaning, but stretched between 2 points that were about to meet whether they were ready or not. Ethan stayed where he was, watching both sides, the wagon inching closer, the riders holding their ground. And in that space between them, he could feel the shape of what was coming. Not conflict, not in the way he had known it before, but something quieter, something that would reveal itself in the choices made when paths finally crossed. The woman's gaze lifted again, briefly, toward the ridge where Ethan stood, and though the distance remained, there was something in that look that carried farther than words. a quiet understanding that whatever happened next would not stay contained to the space below. It would reach beyond it. And as the wagon rolled the final stretch toward the waiting riders, Ethan Cole felt that same pull again, deeper now, not drawing him forward, but holding him exactly where he needed to be to see what truth would rise when two worlds, each carrying their own burden, finally faced one another. The wagon came to a stop about 30 yards from the riders, not forced, not halted by command, but easing into stillness as if the man guiding it understood that whatever waited ahead required more than movement. And Ethan Cole leaned slightly forward on the ridge, every sense narrowed to the space between them. The driver climbed down slowly, boots hitting the ground with a dull sound that carried farther than it should have in the quiet. And for a moment he stood there, one hand still, resting on the worn wood of the wagon, eyes fixed on the group before him like he had traveled too far to hesitate now. The riders did not move toward him. They did not close the distance. Instead, they held their ground in that same deliberate way, leaving the space open, as if what mattered was not who stepped first, but how it was done. The lead rider took one measured step forward, the bundle still held in his hands, and the air between them seemed to tighten again, not with threat, but with something deeper, something that waited to be understood rather than challenged. "You came late," the rider said, his voice carrying across the distance without effort, and the man by the wagon nodded once, slow, his face lined with dust, and something heavier than the miles he had traveled. "Road was longer than I thought," he answered, and there was no apology in it, just truth stated plainly. Ethan's eyes moved to the wagon again, to the shapes tied along its side, and now that he was closer, he could see more clearly that they were not cargo meant for trade, not tools or supplies in the usual sense, but something wrapped with care and urgency, something that had been handled by hands that knew its value without needing to speak of it. The driver stepped back then and reached toward the side of the wagon, fingers working at the knots that held one of the bundles in place, and every movement he made was steady, deliberate, like he understood that what he was about to reveal mattered, just as much as how he revealed it. Below, the woman stood still among the riders, her gaze fixed not on the wagon, but on the man himself, and Ethan saw it then, the quiet recognition in her eyes, not of who he was, but of what he had brought, and that told him more than anything else, because it meant this meeting had not been chance, it had been necessary. The rope loosened, the cloth shifted, and the man lifted one of the bundles free, holding it with both hands as he turned to face the riders fully, and for a second the fading light caught the edge of what lay beneath the wrapping, a glimpse of glass, of something sealed, something fragile and important in equal measure. The lead rider's expression did not change, but Ethan saw the way his shoulders eased just a fraction, the way the tension that had been carried since the first moment of arrival began to settle into something steadier. "You found it," the rider said, and the man gave a slight nod. "Not easily," he replied, and that simple exchange carried more weight than a dozen explanations, because it spoke of distance crossed, of effort given without promise of return. Ethan felt the pieces fall into place then, not all at once, but enough to see the shape of it, the bundle the woman had carried, the one the rider now held, and this one from the wagon. They were not separate stories, they were parts of the same one, different paths leading to the same point. The man stepped forward slowly, closing the distance one careful step at a time, and when he reached the edge of that invisible line between them, he stopped, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the moment itself, and extended the bundle toward the rider. No one spoke as the exchange happened, no sudden movement, no raised voices, just the quiet passing of something that had been carried across distance and risk from two different directions, meeting in the same place at the same time. The rider took it with the same care he had shown before, and for a brief second, as both bundles rested in his hands, Ethan understood that what stood before him was not a confrontation, not even a negotiation, but something far rarer, a meeting built on necessity rather than agreement, on trust shaped by action instead of words. And as the last light faded completely from the sky, he realized that whatever had been hidden between these two worlds was no longer hidden at all. It was being placed out in the open, piece by piece, where it could no longer be ignored. The two bundles rested in the rider's hands, one brought through the town in silence and risk, The other carried across miles of unforgiving ground. And for a long moment no one spoke, because there was nothing left that words could add without taking something away. Ethan Cole remained on the ridge, still as the land beneath him, watching as the rider looked down at what he now held, not as a man claiming something, but as a man confirming that what was needed had finally arrived. The woman stood just behind him, the blue of her dress softened now by the night settling in, no longer a signal, no longer a disguise, just a part of her that had done its work and no longer needed to hide anything at all. The man from the wagon stepped back after the exchange, not lingering, not asking anything in return, and that was when Ethan understood something that had not been clear before. Neither of them had come here for themselves, not for trade, not for gain, but for something that stood beyond both of them, something that required both paths to meet at exactly this place and time. The rider turned slightly then, his gaze moving from the bundles to the others, and though he did not raise his voice, something in the way he stood carried through the group, a quiet signal that whatever had been waiting was now ready to move forward. One by one, the riders shifted, not in urgency, but in purpose, the kind that came from knowing the direction before taking the first step, and the woman moved with them, not as someone returning under watch, but as someone who had completed what she had set out to do. Ethan watched her as she stepped past the place where she had first stood alone, and for a brief second she paused, just enough to glance back toward the ridge, toward him, and there was no warning in her eyes this time, no distance, just a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. He did not raise a hand, did not call out, because anything he might have said would have belonged to the man he was before this moment, not the one standing there now. The riders began to move, turning toward the deeper stretch of hills, the wagon man following at a distance, guiding his horses into line behind them, not leading, not being led, just part of the path now that it had been revealed. The sound of hooves returned, softer this time, steady, blending with the night as if it had always been there, and Ethan felt the pull to follow again, the same instinct that had brought him this far, but he did not move, not this time. Instead, he stood where he was and watched until the shapes below became shadows, until the blue of the dress was no longer visible, until the land returned to its quiet state, as if nothing had happened at all. The wind moved through the hills again, carrying with it the last trace of what had passed, and Ethan let out a slow breath, one he had been holding since the moment he first saw that flash of blue in a place where it did not belong. He looked down at his own hands, at the dust settled into the lines of his skin, and then back toward the dark stretch of land where the riders had gone, and something inside him shifted into place, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like a truth that had always been there waiting to be seen. Out here, he realized, not every line was meant to keep people apart. Some were meant to show who was willing to cross them for the right reason, and sometimes the man who followed thinking he understood the path was the one who needed to learn what it meant. Ethan Cole turned then, slowly, and began the walk back toward the town, the same road, the same dust, but not the same man, because what he had seen would stay with him longer than any trail, a quiet reminder that justice did not always ride in loud and fast. Sometimes it moved in silence, carried by those willing to risk being misunderstood, and when it finally arrived, it did not ask for recognition. It simply did what needed to be done and moved on, leaving the rest of the world to catch up in its own time.